At 10:19 p.m. on July 17, 1944, the sky over California suddenly erupted in bright yellow-orange light, visible for hundreds of miles in all directions. Two ships loaded with 4,600 tons of explosives vanished in seconds, taking with them the lives of 320 men who never knew what hit them. The explosion was powerful enough to be felt in Nevada, 300 miles from the epicenter. A pilot flying at 9,000 feet watched in horror as massive metal fragments flew past his aircraft. A fireball rose 2 miles into the sky, and San Francisco residents, seeing the glow to the east, were convinced a Japanese attack on mainland America had begun. But the enemy wasn't Japanese. It was America itself, destroying its own sons through negligence, haste, and racism that permeated the military system. 15%. That's the portion of all African American deaths in World War II that occurred that night. One night, one location, one pier became the grave for more black sailors than died in any single battle on any front of the war. These men weren't fighting the enemy on the front lines. They were loading ammunition for other soldiers, working without proper training or protection under white officers who organized speed competitions between units and even placed bets on which team could load the deadly cargo faster. A Coast Guard commander warned the Navy, conditions at the base were unsafe, a disaster waiting to happen, change procedures before it's too late. The Navy's response was brief. Your unit is no longer required, we'll handle it ourselves, the war doesn't wait. A month after the disaster, surviving sailors refused to return to work under the same dangerous conditions, with the same officers, in the same system that had killed their comrades. Of 258 who refused, 50 men were charged with mutiny and sentenced to 15 years hard labor in the largest mutiny trial in U.S. Navy history. This story was hidden for 80 years, until 2024, when the Secretary of the Navy finally spoke the words so long awaited. They were right to demand safety. We were wrong to charge them with mutiny. This is the story of Port Chicago, how skin color determined who would risk their lives on the most dangerous job, who would be accused of cowardice when demanding basic safety, and how many decades it would take a nation to admit its mistake. This is the story of 320 dead, of whom only 51 bodies could be identified, while the remaining 269 simply vaporized in the blast. This is the story of 256 sailors branded as traitors for 80 years, simply for wanting to live. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into global war, and it became immediately clear that existing naval depots couldn't handle the massive flow of ammunition needed for the Pacific Campaign. The naval magazine at Mare Island in California was operating at maximum capacity, and command decided to urgently construct a new base capable of ensuring a constant flow of munitions to the front. The choice fell on the small town of Port Chicago, located approximately 30 miles north of San Francisco on Suisun Bay, where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers meet. The location seemed ideal for ammunition transfer. Proximity to rail lines ensured cargo delivery, deep water allowed large vessels to dock, and distance from major cities created an illusion of safety in case of accident. Construction began in February 1942 in an atmosphere of wartime urgency, when every day of delay meant the front wouldn't receive necessary ammunition. By year's end, the base was to begin full operations. On November 30, 1942, the base was officially commissioned as an annex to Mare Island, and on December 8th, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the first ship docked at the pier for loading. However, a critical problem existed from the start that would lead to catastrophe 18 months later: shortage of professional stevedores with experience handling dangerous cargo. All qualified specialists had either been drafted into the Army or had left to work in defense plants where pay was better and risk significantly lower than daily work with tons of explosives. The Navy made a fateful decision. Loading would be performed by sailors themselves, men without specialized education or experience handling munitions, who would learn this deadly work through practice. But another decision was made, based not on military necessity, but on racial prejudices deeply rooted in American society of the time. Exclusively African American units under white officers would be assigned to this dangerous work. This was America in 1942, a land of Jim Crow laws where segregation permeated all spheres of life, including armed forces that fought fascism in Europe but maintained racial separation at home. Even in military uniform, even in service to a common cause, skin color determined what role you would play and what risks you would face. By 1944, thousands of African American sailors had passed through Port Chicago, many only 18 or 19 years old, teenagers in uniform who came to serve their country and were sent to load bombs without proper training. The training they received at Great Lakes Naval Training Station prepared them to be sailors, but not specialists in handling explosives, and at Port Chicago itself, no specialized safety training was conducted at all. The training method was primitive to the point of absurdity. New arrivals watched more experienced comrades and tried to copy their actions, while the experienced themselves learned by trial and error, having neither detailed instructions nor safety protocols that were actually followed in practice. Officers assigned to supervise these operations were mostly reservists called from civilian life, bank clerks, salesmen, teachers given uniforms, rank, and sent to command men working with tons of explosives. These officers reassured recruits, telling them the bombs were completely safe since detonators weren't yet installed and accidental explosion was impossible, assurances that were at best naive and at worst criminally irresponsible. In May 1944, a decision was made to expand the pier to simultaneously load 2 ships, which doubled the base's productivity but simultaneously multiplied catastrophe risk several times, since now more men, more equipment, and more tons of explosives were on one wooden platform simultaneously. Captain Nelson Goss, commanding officer of Mare Island Naval Magazine, to which Port Chicago reported, established an ambitious productivity standard: 10 tons of ammunition per ship hold per hour. In practice, this norm was rarely achieved, but constant pressure to increase loading speed created an atmosphere of haste and disregard for basic safety rules. In April 1944, Port Chicago's new commanding officer, Captain Merrill T. Kinney, introduced a system that definitively turned dangerous work into deadly competition. He began daily posting each division's productivity figures on the dock office board. Kinney explained he'd borrowed this idea from Navy gunnery practice, where shots fired and hits were recorded to create healthy competition, but he didn't account for the fact that target shooting and working with tons of explosives were fundamentally different activities. This system created competitive atmosphere between divisions, where officers began organizing informal contests. Which crew could load more ammunition in an 8-hour shift, sometimes even making monetary bets on their team's results. Black sailors loaded bombs, risking their lives, while white officers bet on their work speed, and no one in leadership was concerned that the chase for productivity records inevitably led to disregard for elementary safety measures. Commander Paul B. Cronk of the Coast Guard, whose unit was responsible for overseeing explosive materials loading at naval facilities, watched events at Port Chicago with growing alarm and horror. Coast Guard regulations clearly prohibited accumulation of large ammunition quantities on piers, use of cargo nets for moving certain explosives types, and rolling bombs across wooden decking. But at Port Chicago, all 3 rules were violated constantly and systematically. Cronk repeatedly warned Navy Command. Working conditions at the base were extremely dangerous. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Procedures must be changed immediately, work pace slowed, and personnel properly trained. On November 1, 1943, Captain Goss replied to Cronk with an official letter whose essence was simple and ruthless. Your safety rules will reduce our productivity. We're at war and can't afford to slow down. Coast Guard unit is no longer required at our base. Kronk was forced to withdraw his unit, understanding he couldn't prevent the approaching catastrophe and could only leave, having recorded his warnings in official documents. 8 months later, exactly what he predicted occurred, and 320 men paid with their lives for Navy Command's arrogance and incompetence. July 13, 1944, 8:15 a.m. The Liberty ship SSEA Bryan docked at Port Chicago Naval Magazine's single pier, arriving with empty holds but full fuel tanks. Aboard were 5,292 barrels of Bunker C heavy fuel, enough to cross the entire Pacific and deliver cargo to troops fighting on islands against Japanese forces. At 10 o'clock that morning, sailors from the ammunition battalion began the monotonous and dangerous work of loading the ship, lowering bombs, shells, and other explosives into its holds, materials arriving continuously by rail. For 4 straight days, work continued around the clock in 3 8-hour shifts, division after division relieving each other as the ship slowly but steadily filled with deadly cargo. By evening of the 17th, E.A. Bryan carried approximately 4,600 tons of various explosives, bombs, depth charges, artillery shells, and ammunition, about 40% of the vessel's maximum capacity. A few more days of loading, and the ship would be ready to depart on its deadly voyage across the ocean, where Japanese submarines and aircraft awaited. Beside E.A. Bryan at the same pier stood a second ship, SS Quinault Victory, a brand new vessel just launched and preparing for its maiden voyage to the combat zone. Loading of this ship had only begun. Its holds contained just a few dozen tons of ammunition, but work continued, and each hour added more tons of explosives to the accumulated cargo. Ashore along the pier stood railway cars loaded with another 400 tons of explosives, awaiting their turn to be transferred to the ships. Bombs of various calibers, depth charges for anti-submarine warfare, artillery shells, and millions of rounds. This entire deadly arsenal lay on the wooden pier waiting. On July 17th, the evening shift began at the usual time, and Division 3, consisting of 98 men, reported for work with the usual sense of routine. Most were African Americans working under supervision of several white officers, standard configuration for all divisions operating at Port Chicago during those segregated years. At 10 p.m., the shift began their duties. Some sailors lowered ammunition into E.A. Bryan's deep holds. Others unloaded railway cars ashore. Still others prepared the next cargo batch for Quinault Victory. This was an ordinary night, ordinary work, routine repeated hundreds of times over recent months, and no one suspected this night would be the last for 320 men. What happened in the next 19 minutes, no survivor saw, because everyone close enough to the explosion's epicenter died instantly, without even understanding what was happening. All we know about the final seconds before catastrophe is based on testimony from people at safe distances and results of subsequent investigation. At 10:18, 1 minute before catastrophe, everything was still completely normal. Sailors worked at their usual pace, ships rocked peacefully at the pier, and the small town of Port Chicago prepared for sleep, unaware of approaching disaster. Then, at 10:19, the world exploded with force that shook the ground for hundreds of miles in all directions and forever changed U.S. Navy history. 2 massive explosions thundered one after another with an interval of only seconds. The first, smaller in force, then the second, whose destructive wave exceeded anything imaginable. Total detonation power was equivalent to 5,000 tons of TNT, or a magnitude 3.4 earthquake on the Richter scale, and the shock wave rolled across the ground for hundreds of miles, shaking buildings and causing panic among people who didn't understand what happened. SSEA Bryan simply ceased to exist as a material object. The ship didn't gradually sink or break apart, it instantly vaporized, blown into millions of fragments by the colossal force of explosion. Hull pieces were found in the bay over subsequent days and weeks, but the largest discovered fragment weighed only a few hundred pounds, though originally this was a vessel 441 feet long with displacement of several thousand tons. SS Quinault Victory, a brand new ship departing on its first voyage, was lifted by the blast wave and hurled over 500 yards directly into Suisun Bay waters. Huge hull sections, superstructure fragments, and countless metal pieces flew through the air like autumn leaves in strong wind, scattered by incomprehensible force throughout the area. The wooden pier, 1,500 feet long, didn't simply collapse or fall apart. It completely vanished from the face of the earth, turning into a cloud of splinters and dust. Everything on it, wood, concrete supports, railway rails, powerful cranes, and tons of equipment, all transformed in an instant into debris scattered across a vast territory. Railway cars with 400 tons of explosives standing ashore beside the pier detonated in succession, creating a chain reaction of explosions, each adding its share of destruction to an already apocalyptic scene. A giant pillar of fire shot more than 2 miles into the night sky, and eyewitnesses observing this spectacle from safe distance described it as an enormous glowing yellow-orange mushroom, like a small sun suddenly appearing on Earth. In Port Chicago town, located just a few miles from the base, the blast wave shattered absolutely all windows, tore doors from hinges, and damaged every building without exception. People were literally knocked off their feet by the impact's force, and many's first thought was that a powerful earthquake had started, or that the Japanese had somehow managed to strike mainland United States. In San Francisco, approximately 30 miles southwest of Port Chicago, thousands of people ran into the streets, seeing the sky to the east suddenly illuminate with bright, ominous light. Air raid sirens began wailing, radio stations broadcast contradictory and confused reports, and no one could understand what exactly was happening: Japanese attack, major accident, or some other catastrophe. A pilot flying at 9,000 feet over the bay, conducting routine patrol, later testified with barely concealed horror that he saw metal ship fragments flying past his aircraft at such enormous height. Hull pieces, equipment parts, construction fragments, all lifted nearly 2 miles up by incredible explosion force and fell back to Earth over many minutes. Seismographs in Nevada, located approximately 300 miles east of the catastrophe site, clearly recorded a powerful shock equivalent to a magnitude 3.4 earthquake. On the pier, and immediately nearby at the moment of explosion, were approximately 320 people: sailors of Division 3, crews of both loading ships, several civilian workers, and officers supervising the loading process. All died absolutely instantly, having not the slightest chance of escape and not even time to understand what was happening around them. There was no time to be frightened, no time to attempt to flee, not even time to recognize the danger. In one moment they were performing their work, and in the next they no longer existed. Another 390 people received injuries of varying severity. In Port Chicago town itself, at neighboring military facilities, within a radius of several miles from the explosion's epicenter. Burns from flash and thermal radiation, multiple shrapnel wounds, trauma from shock wave that knocked people down and threw them against building walls. Fires immediately erupted throughout the naval base territory. Buildings burned, spilled fuel from destroyed tanks ignited and spread fire further. Thick black smoke rose to the sky, obscuring stars for many miles around. Surviving sailors, those far enough from the pier not to perish, immediately rushed to extinguish fires, rescue the wounded, and search for possible survivors, though deep down everyone understood there could be no survivors on the pier itself. By morning of July 18th, fires were finally extinguished by joint efforts of military fire teams and civilian services. Smoke gradually dispersed, and the full picture of destruction became visible. From the massive pier that just hours earlier had been a center of active operations, absolutely nothing remained. only level ground on shore where once stood an enormous wooden structure. Bay water for hundreds of yards was covered with floating debris, wood pieces, twisted metal, equipment parts, fragments of what yesterday were ships. The shore was strewn with metal fragments of various sizes, some weighing tons and thrown hundreds of meters from the explosion site. The terrible work of searching for bodies of the dead began, work no one wanted to perform, but someone had to do. African American sailors who survived the catastrophe were denied leave automatically granted to all white officers for 30 days, and were instead assigned the heaviest and most traumatic task: searching for and collecting remains of their fallen comrades. They walked along the bay shore, peering into the water, collecting what little could be found: body parts, scraps of burned clothing, any evidence that people had been here, that they lived and worked. Of 320 sailors and civilians killed, only 51 could be confidently identified from their body remains, while the remaining 269 people simply disappeared, literally vaporized in fire and shockwave of such unimaginable power. 2/3 of all killed that night were African Americans, 202 black sailors, representing 15% of the total number of all African Americans killed throughout World War II in all theaters of operations. This was more losses than in any single battle involving African American units, more than among black soldiers in the Normandy landing, more than at any other place or event of the entire war. But this wasn't a battle with the enemy. This wasn't a heroic fight for freedom. This was negligence, multiplied by racism. This was a system that valued ammunition loading speed above human lives. On July 31, 1944, a solemn memorial ceremony was held at the base, with officers' speeches, moment of silence, and promises that such tragedy would never happen again. But none of the speakers mentioned the real causes of catastrophe. No one discussed criminal absence of personnel training. No one mentioned dangerous practice of organizing competitions between divisions and betting on work speed. The most important question, why this happened and who bears responsibility, was never asked publicly. July 21st, just 4 days after the explosion, an official court of inquiry began under Captain Albert G. Acker, Jr., tasked with determining the catastrophe's causes. For 39 days, the commission interrogated 120 witnesses, studied mountains of documents, and compiled a 1,200-page report. The inquiry's conclusions were completely predictable to those who understood how the military system works. All white officers were fully cleared of any guilt or negligence. The exact cause of initial explosion cannot be determined due to complete absence of direct witnesses and scale of destruction that eliminated all evidence. But in the voluminous report was a subtle, carefully worded hint. Whatever the true cause of detonation, African American ammunition handlers working on the pier probably had some relation to it. This wasn't a direct accusation against dead sailors, but it was sufficient indication to sow doubt and shift the burden of guilt from officers to subordinates. The system protected its own. White officers who created dangerous working conditions were found innocent, while black sailors who died because of those conditions fell under suspicion. And surviving African American sailors, mourning their fallen comrades, thought only one thing: will they really send us back to load ammunition on a new pier, with the same officers, under the same deadly, dangerous conditions? In days following the catastrophe, all surviving sailors from Port Chicago were transferred to Mare Island Naval Magazine in neighboring Vallejo for temporary housing, while command decided what to do next with men who had survived such terrible trauma. These sailors were in a state of deep shock. Many had seen the explosion from a distance and watched the fireball rise into the sky. All without exception participated in terrible searches for their comrades' remains, and everyone had lost close friends. They asked questions again and again, trying to understand the incomprehensible. Why did this catastrophe happen? What exactly went wrong? Will working conditions finally change? Will they finally receive real training in handling ammunition? But clear answers didn't come from command, only silence and evasive phrases. And then came a new order that changed everything. In the second week of August 1944, just 3 weeks after the catastrophe, officers at Mare Island assembled the sailors and announced, "Time to resume ammunition loading work." The ship San Gay was waiting at the pier and must be loaded as soon as possible. The war in the Pacific continues, and troops at the front urgently need ammunition. So it's time to forget the past and return to duty. The sailors responded with categorical refusal. No, we won't return to work without real training. They had survived an explosion that took 320 lives just 3 weeks ago. They had collected friends' remains with their own hands. They had seen the result of what happens when safety is sacrificed to speed. They no longer wanted to be the next victims of the same system, the same negligence, the same carelessness. About 330 men simultaneously refused to obey orders, almost all African American sailors who survived Port Chicago and were transferred to Mare Island. This was an unprecedented act of collective disobedience in U.S. Navy history, and command reacted immediately and harshly. Admiral Carlton H. Wright, commander of the 12th Naval District, personally arrived at Mare Island to deal with the situation and assembled all refusing sailors for a stern lecture with threats. His speech was brief and harsh. The country is at war. Refusal to obey a direct order is a serious military crime called mutiny and punishable by death or long imprisonment at hard labor. He gave them a final chance. Obey the order right now and we'll forget your misconduct, or face severe consequences that will destroy your life forever. Part of the sailors wavered under the weight of threats. Fear of court and long prison years proved stronger than fear of another explosion. About 280 men returned to work, reluctantly, with horror and despair in their eyes, but returned because they saw no other way out. But 50 men continued to stand their ground despite all threats. These 50 sailors firmly said no to the system that killed their friends. They insisted, "We won't return to work under the same deadly, dangerous conditions, with the same officers who bet on our speed, without any real safety training, without any guarantees that the next explosion won't take our lives." Their names were immediately recorded. They were placed under arrest awaiting trial, and they were charged with the most serious offense in military code: conspiracy to commit mutiny against lawful authority of the United States. These 50 men entered history as the Port Chicago 50, 50 African American sailors who refused to die without good reason and were punished for this desire to live. Among the accused was Joe Small, one of the protest's informal leaders, who decades later explained his position this way: "I wasn't trying to avoid work, and I don't think the other men were trying to avoid their duty. But to return to work under absolutely the same conditions, without any safety improvements, without changes in procedures, with the same group of officers, we simply thought there must be a better alternative than risking our lives again in a system that had already proven its deadly danger." The trial began in September 1944 and became the largest mutiny trial in U.S. Navy history. 50 defendants, all African Americans, all charged with the same crime. Defense was minimal and clearly insufficient. All accused were tried together as a single group, despite each having their own individual story, their own motives, their own level of participation in the protest. This was group trial with group accusation, presupposing group sentence, which completely contradicted basic principles of fair judicial process. Defense attorneys had no access to the full inquiry report about the Port Chicago explosion, a report that could have confirmed their main assertion about unsafe working conditions and contained specific recommendations for improving ammunition loading procedures. The trial proceeded quickly. Witness testimony, interrogations of the accused, prosecution and defense arguments, and finally, a verdict that surprised no one. All 50 defendants were found guilty of conspiracy to commit mutiny. All 50 were sentenced to 15 years hard labor in federal prison, and all 50 received dishonorable discharges from naval service, forever depriving them of veteran benefits and the right to be considered honorably served. What exactly were they so severely punished for? For refusing to return to work that killed 320 of their comrades in a single night? for demanding elementary training in safe explosive handling methods, for wanting to live and not become the next victims of a system that valued productivity above human lives. Another 208 sailors who initially refused, but then submitted under threat pressure, were also convicted on lesser charges and received various punishments, from fines to short prison terms. During the trial, NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, one of the leading organizations fighting for African American rights, got involved in the case. They sent their observer to the trial, and this observer was Thurgood Marshall, a young, talented lawyer who many years later would become the first African American Supreme Court justice, but in 1944 was simply a fighter for justice. Marshall attended court sessions and carefully observed everything. He saw the trial's flagrant injustice, saw how military justice turned into an instrument of racial revenge, how 50 men were punished not for actual crime, but for daring to demand elementary safety. He wrote a detailed report about the process, but couldn't influence or change the sentence. The system had already rendered its verdict, and there was no turning back. 47 of the 50 convicted mutineers were released in January 1946, a few months after the war ended, when tensions subsided and the need for their punishment seemed to disappear. But all were released with dishonorable discharges, forever branding them as traitors and cowards in society's eyes, depriving them of opportunity to receive veteran benefits, medical care, and other assistance the state provided to all who served honorably. The remaining 3 served additional months in prison for disciplinary violations during their sentence, for refusing to fully submit to prison regime, for maintaining their dignity even in confinement. The story didn't end there, but for most Americans it never even began. The Port Chicago explosion quickly disappeared from news, lost among thousands of other wartime events, and the trial of the Port Chicago 50 was almost never covered in national press. 50 sailors returned to civilian life with the indelible brand of mutineers and traitors, without military benefits, without society's respect, without recognition of what they went through and what they fought for. But their protest, their willingness to risk freedom for justice, their refusal to be silent and docilely die, all this had consequences, though results manifested not immediately, but only over years and decades. In late 1944, just months after Port Chicago events, serious racial disturbances erupted at the naval base on Guam between black and white sailors. Accumulated tension caused by constant discrimination and unequal treatment reached boiling point, resulting in violence outbreaks, numerous arrests, and another stain on the Navy's reputation as it still tried to cope with Port Chicago's aftermath. Among the accused was Joe Small, one of the protest's informal leaders, who decades later explained his position this way: "I wasn't trying to avoid work, and I don't think the other men were trying to avoid their duty. But to return to work under absolutely the same conditions, without any safety improvements, without changes in procedures, with the same group of officers, we simply thought there must be a better alternative than risking our lives again in a system that had already proven its deadly danger." In March 1945, an entire CB battalion, consisting of 1,000 African American construction workers, staged a mass hunger strike at their base in Port Hueneme, California. This was organized protest against continuing discriminatory work and living conditions, against racism that permeated all levels of military hierarchy and made black soldiers' and sailors' service unbearable even in wartime. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, one of the U.S. Navy's highest leaders, began seeing a clear pattern in these events. Port Chicago wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of deeper systemic problem threatening fleet combat readiness. Together with Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal and civilian racial affairs expert Lester Granger, King began developing an ambitious plan for complete racial integration of naval forces, a revolutionary idea for mid-1940s America. The Port Chicago disaster, the trial of the Port Chicago 50, and subsequent racial incidents helped catalyze the movement toward implementing new standards of equality and justice in armed forces. Though changes occurred slowly and with significant resistance from the conservative part of the officer corps, direction was set and there was no turning back. On July 26, 1948, 4 years after the Port Chicago explosion, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which officially abolished racial segregation in all U.S. armed forces. This order ended official racial separation that had existed since the nation's founding and opened a new era in American military history. However, change didn't happen instantly in one day. The process of actual desegregation took years, meeting resistance at many levels of military hierarchy, especially in southern states where Jim Crow traditions were most entrenched. But the direction was irreversible, and gradually black and white soldiers and sailors began serving side by side in the same units, judged by the same criteria, and receiving equal opportunities for advancement. But for the 50 convicted Port Chicago sailors, these historic changes meant nothing. They remained with dishonorable discharges, branded as mutineers, deprived of all veteran benefits and the right to be considered honorably served. Decades passed, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and America changed before their eyes. The civil rights movement achieved repeal of Jim Crow laws. New legislation opened access to education and employment for African Americans. Public consciousness gradually overcame racial prejudices. But for Port Chicago veterans, justice never came. Their sentences remained in force. Their sacrifice wasn't recognized. Their story was forgotten by all except a small group of historians and activists. In 1990, an organized campaign began for exoneration of the Port Chicago 50. 25 U.S. congressmen supported the initiative to review the case. They studied all documents, interviewed surviving participants, consulted with historians and lawyers. The congressmen saw obvious injustice. Sailors were convicted for demanding elementary safety after a catastrophe that killed 320 people due to command negligence. They demanded the Navy review sentences, acknowledge the error, and restore these men's honor. But the campaign failed. The Navy categorically refused to review the case, stating sentences were lawful and fair by the standards of that time. Gordon Collier, who during the explosion served as senior petty officer and continued loading ammunition after the catastrophe, gave an interview in 1990 expressing the position of many veterans of that time. His words were full of bitterness and incomprehension. Hundreds of men like me continued loading ammunition despite danger and fear. These are the ones who should be recognized as heroes, not those who refused to perform their duty. His message was crystal clear. Real heroes are those who obeyed orders and returned to dangerous work, not those who refused and demanded changes. Even 46 years after the tragedy, even understanding the catastrophe occurred due to command negligence, some veterans couldn't accept the idea that refusing a dangerous order could be justified. On July 15, 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the catastrophe, a small memorial was opened at the site of the former Port Chicago Naval Magazine in memory of the 320 killed. This was the first official step toward acknowledging the tragedy, but it didn't include exoneration for the 256 sailors convicted after the explosion, and didn't acknowledge the injustice of their accusation and punishment. Years continued relentlessly, and veterans died one after another. Of the 50 convicted mutineers, most passed away without ever seeing the justice they deserved. They died branded as traitors. Their families bore this shame. Their story remained unknown to the wider public, buried under layers of forgetting and unwillingness to admit past mistakes. 2024 arrived, the 80th anniversary of the catastrophe, a new generation of Navy leadership with new understanding of history and justice. On July 17, 2024, exactly 80 years after the explosion, Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro made a historic statement that changed everything. All 256 accused, the 50 men convicted of mutiny, and 208 sailors convicted on lesser charges, were fully and unconditionally exonerated. Their sentences were annulled, charges dropped, dishonorable discharges revoked, their honor restored before history and the nation. Del Toro spoke openly and honestly. These men were absolutely right in their demands. They demanded safer working conditions after a catastrophe that occurred due to negligence and disregard for safety by command. They refused to work under circumstances that killed 320 of their comrades. And this wasn't mutiny, it was common sense. It was the desire to live. It was courage, not cowardice. 80 years of waiting, an entire human lifetime from birth to old age, 4 generations of people. That's how long it took a great power to speak simple words. Forgive us, we were wrong. Most of the exonerated had long since died. They didn't live to see this day of justice. They died with the unshed brand of mutineers and traitors, and only their families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, received the exoneration that should have come 8 decades ago. Better late than never, this is true, but bitter truth, because for those who suffered from injustice, this exoneration came too late, when they could no longer hear these words. The Port Chicago disaster forever changed Navy practices for handling ammunition. Completely new, strict safety procedures were implemented for loading explosives, mandatory professional training for everyone working with dangerous materials, complete ban on any speed competitions between divisions, end to betting and gambling practices on work productivity. The ammunition itself was modified for significantly greater safety. Detonators now always stored and transported separately from main charges. Procedures were fully standardized at all naval facilities, and personnel training became mandatory and thorough. All this should have been done from the beginning, but instead these lessons were bought with the blood of 320 sailors. How many lives did these new safety rules save in subsequent decades? Impossible to calculate precisely, but one can confidently say, thousands of sailors are alive today precisely because after Port Chicago, the Navy finally understood that safety is no less important than speed. Today, at the site of the former Port Chicago Naval Magazine, stands a national memorial that is part of the National Park Service system and serves as a reminder of the deadliest disaster on U.S. territory during World War II. Visitors from across the country come here to see where once stood a 1,500-foot pier, and now only quiet bay waters remain, keeping memory of that terrible night of July 17, 1944. The memorial tells 2 intertwined stories. The story of the explosion that took 320 lives in an instant, and the story of what followed. The story of systemic racism, judicial injustice, and exoneration that came 80 years after the tragedy. Of the 50 men exonerated in 2024 on mutiny charges, almost all are dead. Perhaps 1 or 2 still live. Very old men over 90 who saw justice, but most of their comrades never saw this moment. Joe Small, one of the refusal's leaders and the most famous of the Port Chicago 50, died without seeing exoneration, though in 1990 he gave a detailed interview for a documentary in which he told his story and explained their protest's motives. The Port Chicago story is about many things simultaneously, about the real cost of war, paid not only on battlefields, about racism that penetrated all levels of American society, including armed forces, about the courage of those who dared to say no to an unjust system. But it's also a story about how justice is possible even after 80 years, even when most witnesses have long died, even when it seems too late to change anything. 320 people died that July night in 1944, 15% of total African American losses throughout World War II, more than in any single battle, in one instant, in one place. 256 men were unjustly convicted by military courts for demanding elementary safety after a catastrophe that killed their friends, and were called mutineers for the natural desire to live and not become the next victims of a negligent system. 80 years waiting for justice, time sufficient for most to pass away without hearing the words, "You were right, we were wrong, forgive us." Port Chicago isn't completely forgotten. Its story is told in school history textbooks, in museum exhibits devoted to World War II, in documentaries and historical research, in the memorial on the bay shore, where an annual commemoration ceremony is held. Young sailors today learn from past mistakes. They receive thorough professional training in handling dangerous materials, work under conditions where safety is valued above speed, serve in integrated units where they're judged by competence, not skin color. This is Port Chicago's legacy. Not only tragedy and death, but important lessons that changed the Navy forever. Not only injustice, but ultimate triumph of truth. 320 names are engraved on the memorial, reminding every visitor of the cost of negligence and safety disregard. 256 names officially exonerated in 2024, their honor restored before history. All of them, both the dead and the convicted, are part of one large story about how dearly ignoring elementary safety rules can cost, how long injustice can last in a society unwilling to admit its mistakes, and how important it is, finally, to find courage to tell the truth, even if it comes too late for those who needed it most. 15% in one night, a figure impossible to forget, a reminder that war kills not only on battlefields, and that justice, even delayed, is always better than its complete absence.